G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Jeremiah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So we're looking at session 16. We're going to do chapter 25 today. Just a very quick summary. Last session, we had the vision of the good and bad figs. Jeremiah was asked, what did he see? He saw two baskets of good figs, bad figs at the temple. Now the good figs were very good, and the good figs basically represented those who would be taken away in the second deportation. They'd be taken out of the land of Judah into Babylon, and they were regarded as the good figs because while they were down in Babylon, that they would prosper and they would also be cured of their idolatry as well. And eventually there was a promise of bringing them back into the land. And they'll be perpetually back in the land and be a restored nation, never to be uprooted again. And then he saw the bad figs, and the bad figs, he says, well, they were so bad they couldn't be eaten. Now, they represented those who would be left behind after the second deportation in 597 BC. They'd be left behind in the land of Judah. They were bad because they would be come under the 586 BC destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and so they would suffer death by the sword, pestilence, and whatnot. So we also learn Jeremiah was talking about in the future the restoration of the land. Well, we do know that it wasn't simply restoration back into Judah in 536 BC, but because he was talking about that they would be never uprooted again, when in fact a major dispersion happened in 70 AD when the Romans came along and destroyed again Jerusalem and the temple. But it's talking about a future restoration, which would be the restoration after the tribulation, when the Messianic kingdom is now set up and when they've called for Jesus to return. And that's what Jeremiah was prophesying about there, that in the future, there will be a time when they'll be fully restored to the land, never to be uprooted again, and also that they would be all turned to God with whole hearts, means that they'd be regenerated. So that was what was going to be on my notes, but I deleted them somehow. Okay. So we're now into chapter 25, and we're coming into the 70 years of captivity. Chapter 25 ends a segment of the 8 messages of Jeremiah. We're going to see the 7th and 8th messages are in this chapter. The 7th message deals specifically with the 70 years of captivity. And then Jeremiah has already mentioned the fact of the coming captivity several times in his book. Several times that we've seen this. However, he never actually stated how long the captivity would last. Now he's about to deal with a specific timetable. He's about to give us the reasons for the 70 years of captivity in verses 1 to 7. So the reason for the captivity. In verse 1, the word that came to Jeremiah concerning all the people of Judah in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah. The same was the 1st year of Nebuchadrezzar, king of Babylon. So the date of the prophecy is the 4th year of Jehoiakim. So this is the first exact date given in the book of Jeremiah. It's the first of several times, actually, that he'll give some more exact dates, which he hasn't done that up until now, but he will. Actually, if you're going to write these down, chapter 28, verse 1, chapter 32, verse 1, chapter 36, verse 1, chapter 39, verse 1. So that's 28, 32, 36, 39, verse 1, where he gives specific dates. This particular year that we're talking about here falls somewhere between 606, 605 BC, and it marks, and this is the first deportation, so it marks the beginning of the 70-year period. It's also the time of the first deportation. It's also a crucial year because in Jeremiah chapter 36, in this year, the same king Jehoiakim will burn the first book that Jeremiah wrote of his prophecies. So this year marked a turning point for Judah, because now many of the prophecies that Jeremiah gave are about to begin to be fulfilled, to begin being fulfilled. Now, while full fulfillment for his near prophecies will not come until 40 years after he gave them, after 23 years, some of his prophecies will begin to be fulfilled. Now, this was the year of the Battle of Carchemish, when Nebuchadnezzar defeated the Egyptians under Pharaoh Necho, and his victory resulted in the balance of power shifting from Assyria to Neo-Babylonia. And shortly after the battle, Nebuchadnezzar now ascends the throne in Babylon, and he became ruler of the world. And we say ruler of the world because God gave Babylon the world that they could rule. They didn't take it up fully then. Now, later the same year, Nebuchadnezzar invaded Palestine, and he attacked Jerusalem, and then he deported some of the people of Judah to Babylon. Okay. Verse 2, it says here, which Jeremiah the prophet spake unto all the people of Judah and to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, saying, from the 13th year of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah, even unto this day, these 23 years, the word of Jehovah has come unto me. And I have spoken unto you, rising up early and speaking. But you have not listened, you have not hearkened. So he points out, Jeremiah points out here that he began with the 13th year of Josiah, which was 627 BC, even to the time that he wrote this chapter, which is somewhere around about 665 BC, somewhere there. He had begun prophesying. So of these 23 years, 19 of them were under a good king, which was good King Josiah. Now, many of his negative prophecies were under this good King Josiah. It also included a period where he was for 3 months under Shallum or Jehoahaz. Also, he had 4 years under King Jehoiakim. Now, in verse 3, he summarizes his ministry. And basically, for a 23-year period, he received direct and divine revelation from God. And when he received it, he then spoke those words to the people. Now, it seems that the way God dealt with him was that part of the eternal counsel of God was that when dealing with Jeremiah, it would be early in the morning. So not only did the prophet receive these revelations early, but he also passed them on to the people early in the day. However, people didn't listen. Maybe the people were all afternoon people. So Jeremiah's prophecies, quick recap, began in the 13th year of Josiah, which was 627 BC, prophesied for 19 years under a good King Josiah. Most of his prophecies were negative. 3 months under Jehoahaz or Shallum, and then 4 years under King Jehoiakim. Now, verses 4 to 6 now point out that Judah had received messages from previous prophets. Yet, according to verse 4, they too had been rejected. Now, it says, Jehovah has sent unto you all his servants the prophets, rising up early and sending them. But you have not hearkened, nor inclined your ear to hear. So he had repeatedly sent other prophets to them, true prophets, not false prophets, but true prophets. But the people did not listen to them either. So this just compounded their sin. God would do them no harm if they turned away from idolatry, rejecting the pagan deities and those little idols that they made and they served and worshipped, because this actually angered Jehovah. The people, however, they simply refused to listen to these prophets. And some of the contemporary prophets were Uriah, which you see him in chapter 26. Verses 20 to 23, Uriah. Another one was Zephaniah, and then we had Habakkuk. And then remembering down in Babylon, there was Ezekiel as well. But they never listened to these prophets. Now, as far as the message of the previous prophets is concerned, in verse 5, it reveals to us that there was a call to turn away from sin. saying, return ye now every one from his evil way and from the evil of your doings, and dwell in the land that Jehovah has given you and to your fathers from of old, and even forevermore. So just like Jeremiah, the previous prophets had urged the people to turn, remember that word turn, shuv, to turn away from their evil ways, turn away from their sin. The key blessing for obedience would mean that they'd be allowed to dwell in the land that Jehovah had given to their forefathers forever. If they had been obedient to God, they would still be there today. In accordance with the Abrahamic covenant, Israel's possession of the land is always eternal, and the nation never loses the right of ownership. However, in accordance with the Mosaic covenant and the land covenant, enjoyment of the land is dependent upon obedience. And that's why today they're not enjoying the land. They're under attack all the time because they rejected the Messiah. So not only were the people of Judah to turn away from sin, but according to verse 6, they were also to turn to God. So turn away from your sin, turn to God. He says, go not after other gods to serve them and to worship them, and provoke me not to anger with the work of your hands, and I will do you no hurt. So the very act of serving other gods, which are idols, and also, gods like Baal, that naturally provoked God to anger. The sin of idolatry was representative of all their sins. The people of Israel should have never served other gods. And if they had kept this part of the command, the promise was that God would do them no hurt or harm. Now, according to verse 7, the people didn't listen. Yet you have not hearkened unto me, says Jehovah, that you may provoke me to anger with the work of your hands to your own hurt. So the people had not listened to the Lord, but instead they deliberately provoked him to anger by making idols. And the result was that they are now harmed, or they were harmed. Now, what's the means of judgment that we're going to see here? In verses 8 to 11, we see this. So the people have repeatedly rejected God's warnings through the prophets. And then in verse 8, because they've done this, therefore, thus says Jehovah of hosts, because you have not heard my word. So the reason for judgment here is disobedience. They didn't listen to the prophets. They've not heard the voice of the prophets. And then in verse 9, behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, says Jehovah, and I will send unto Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant. So the means will be the king of Babylon. For many chapters now, Jeremiah indicated that the judgment would come from the north. And here Jeremiah affirms for the first time that the threatened conquerors will not only come from the north, but they're going to originate in Babylon. And now he identifies the king. The king is going to be Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, notice what he's called here. He's called my servant. He's called God's servant. Now, he's not God's servant in the sense of being a prophet or a believer in him, but God sometimes applied the title of servant to a non-believer when he used him to accomplish his purposes. Now, here he calls Nebuchadnezzar my servant because he's going to use Nebuchadnezzar to accomplish the prophecies of Jerusalem's destruction and captivity. He'll be the servant. He'll call his Nebuchadnezzar his servant twice more in the book of Jeremiah. First, we're going to see it again in Jeremiah 27, verse 6, and then Jeremiah 43, verse 10. Now, God also called another king servant, and that was Cyrus. God calls Cyrus, an unbelieving pagan king, his servant in Isaiah 44, verse 28 to 45, verse 1. He also will accomplish God's purpose in fulfilling prophecy. Now, Cyrus, in contrast to Nebuchadnezzar, will be used to release the Jews from the Babylonian captivity. So two pagan kings are given the title of God's servants. First, Nebuchadnezzar, who will bring them into captivity, and then secondly, Cyrus, who will release them from captivity, both servants of God. Verse 9 continues, and will bring them against this land. So these are the people from the north, bring them against this land and against the inhabitants thereof, and against all these nations round about. And I will utterly destroy them and make them an astonishment and a hissing and perpetual desolations. So as God's servant in this sense we're talking of here, Nebuchadnezzar's task is to come against the land, come against the citizens of the land, and to come against the surrounding nations as well. So he's taking over. And the result will be that there will be destruction in Judah and the surrounding nations. Now, it doesn't specifically tell us here what these other nations were to be. It doesn't specify. Jehovah would give Nebuchadnezzar great military success and use him to destroy Judah and the surrounding nations. These pagan nations will also become an astonishment, a hissing, and a perpetual desolation. So since God's people would not listen to his servants, the prophets, which we go back to verse 4, you can see there, they failed to listen to God's servants, the prophets, so the Lord would send another type of servant to get their attention, and get their attention he did. In verses 10 to 11, the results of Babylon's invasions are given. In verse 10, moreover, I will take from them the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, the sound of the millstones, the light of the lamp. So there's going to be an end of things that were common in the past. He would remove everyday joy from their lives. There'll be an end of the voice of mirth and gladness, so there's no parties, no festivities. End of the voice of the bridegroom and bride, no marriages. End of the sound of the millstones, no labor. End of the light of the lamp, no oil. And in verse 11, he says what the result would be. And this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment. And these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. So the entire land will now become a desolation and an astonishment for 70 years. And that during which Israel and Judah would be absent from the promised land. This is the first prophecy of the length of the Babylonian captivity. They'd not observed 70 sabbatical years, so the 70-year exile would restore rest to the land. You can find that in 2 Chronicles 36, 20 to 22. We're going to look at these anyway. And then Daniel 9, 1 to 2. 2 Chronicles 36, 20 to 22. Daniel 9, 1 to 2. Okay. These nations shall serve the king of Babylon 7 years. Now, Judah would become a desolation and a horror and serve Babylon 70 years. Now, two ways we can look at this time span. First, the phrase 70 years, it could refer to the period that began with the first deportation, which was 605 BC, around a bit there, and ended with the return of the Jewish people in 536 BC. And so that would give 606, 605 to 536, around about 70 years. Second, it could refer to the period that began with the destruction of the temple in 586 BC and ended with the rebuilding of the temple in 515 BC. And these are the other references here we're going to talk about. I'm going to just read through some of the stuff for you. Here we go. 2 Chronicles 36, 20 to 21. This is just highlighting the 70 years that was spoken about by throughout the rest of the Bible. And them that had escaped from the sword carried he away to Babylon, and they were servants to him and his sons until the reign of the kingdom of Persia, that's Cyrus, to fulfill the word of Jehovah by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbath, for as long as it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. So this passage states that the 70 years of captivity were meant to make up for the Sabbath years that the Israelites failed to observe. They didn't keep the Sabbath years. Jeremiah 29:10, we're going to look at not too long. For this says Jehovah, after 70 years are accomplished at Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word toward you in causing you to return to this place. So the exiles should, Jeremiah 29 will tell us that the exiles should not believe false prophets who were predicting a soon return to the land. In actual fact, the captivity would last for 70 years, and 70 years it did. What he's saying is the people should just live life in as normal a fashion as they can in the land. They should marry, have children, so that the Jewish population would not decrease, but actually increase. That's Jeremiah 29:4-10. Daniel 9:2, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of the years whereof the word of Jehovah came to Jeremiah the prophet for the accomplishing of the desolations of Jerusalem, even 70 years. So Daniel, who was studying the prophecies of Jeremiah 25 and 29, knew that the captivity was to end soon, and at the same time he misunderstood what Jeremiah said in chapter 29 and thought that the Messianic kingdom was going to be set up straight after the 70 years had ended. But he had to be explained to by the angel. Now the fourth passage is Zechariah 1:12. And the angel of Jehovah answered and said, O Jehovah of hosts, how long will you not have mercy on Jerusalem and in the cities of Judah, against which you have had indignation these 70 years? So this speaks of God's indignation against Judah for a 70-year period. So we have that the captivity is 70 years. Now, we're going to have the judgment of Babylon. And now, just looking at the context of the Babylonian captivity, we need to remember the biblical principle that God will use Gentile nations to punish Israel. However, with all the time that he uses these Gentile nations, he has always set a boundary for them. And that boundary is spelled out in Genesis 12, verse 3. Genesis 12:3. I will bless them that bless you, him that curses you will I curse. That's Genesis 12:3. So what this protection does is that if the nations overstep the purpose of their calling and harmed Israel more than God had intended, they would receive divine judgment. And the punishment that they would experience is curse for curse in kind. That was the idea of Genesis 12:3. So apparently there came a point when Babylon, who were God's tool for the punishment of Judah, overstepped her boundaries. So therefore, in verses 12-14, these verses speak of the judgment that would now come against Babylon because they went beyond what God had ordained for them to do against Judah. Now, in 25, verse 12-14, it begins in verse 12 with the timing of this judgment. It shall come to pass when 70 years are accomplished that I will punish the king of Babylon. And that nation, says Jehovah, for their iniquity and the land of the Chaldeans, and I'll make it desolate forever. So after the 70 years of Israel's captivity were now over, God would punish the king of Babylon and his nation. And the reason was that they had become guilty of iniquity. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, God's tool for the punishment of Judah, had overstepped his boundaries, and he went beyond what God had called for in dealing with Judah. His attitude became proud and hateful, so he went beyond his bounds. And as a result, the nation would be eternally desolate. This is Babylon, eternally desolate. Now, evidently, this prophecy was not fulfilled when Persia conquered Babylon, for the nation did not turn into an everlasting desolation. Therefore, this statement is a far prophecy that will be fulfilled at the end of the tribulation, and we'll check that out when we get down to Jeremiah chapters 50 and 51. So this desolation of Babylon is still today, even future, because it's still there. In verse 13, what will occur will be the fulfillment of prophecy. So I'll bring about upon that land all my words which I have pronounced against it, even all that is written in this book. So the prophecies against Babylon are found in Jeremiah 50 and 51. Now, he does not limit God's judgment to Babylon, but he also includes against all the nations. So this is sometime in the future. So Jeremiah's prophecies against all the nations comprise chapters 46 to 51. 46 to 51. Babylon in particular will receive the largest segment of the treatment in Jeremiah 50 to 51. We'll see it on the next page. The third segment of Jeremiah is his prophecies against the nations. Now, the statement in verse 13 also sets the stage for the eighth message, which begins in verse 15. And this is the cup of wrath against the nations. Now, according to verse 14, the judgment of Babylon means that the nation that once took others captive would become an exile herself. She'd be taken captive. For many nations and great kings shall make bondmen of them, even of them, and I will recompense them according to their deeds and according to the work of their hands. So just as they once took Jews into captivity, a day was coming when the Babylonians would be taken into captivity. Now, some of these many nations with great kings included the Medes and the Persians and several allies under Cyrus the Great. So this proves the validity of God's promise in Genesis 12, verse 3. As an outworking of the biblical principle established in that verse, Babylon would experience a curse for a curse in kind. Babylon took the Jews captive. Now, Babylonians are themselves going to be taken captive and exiled. Now we see the cup of wrath against the nations in verses 15 to 38. And this is the remainder of chapter 25. We see a number of Gentile nations with judgments against them here. And this is the eighth and final message from Jeremiah in this section. Now, this is sort of like an introduction or a summary of the third section of Jeremiah's book, which is going to be chapters 46 to 51. And this third section, 46 to 51, will expand on what we're going to look at here in these verses 15 to 38. So we see the list of the nations here in verses 15 to 26. Verse 15 to 16 record the command of God, beginning in verse 16 with Jehovah's address to Jeremiah. For thus says Jehovah, the God of Israel, unto me, take this cup of wine, take this cup of the wine of wrath at my hand, and cause all the nations to whom I send you to drink it. So God instructed Jeremiah to take from his hand, figuratively, a cup of his wrath, and to cause all the nations to whom the Lord would send him to drink it. Now, the cup is a common figure for the wrath of God in Scripture. It's used extensively. We find it in places like Job 21:20, Psalm 60, verse 3, Isaiah 51:17 and 22, Jeremiah 49:12, Jeremiah 51:7, Lamentations 4, verse 21, Ezekiel 23:31 and 35. In the New Testament, we also find it there. So it's a very common figure in the book of Revelation. It's found in Revelation 14, verse 8, 10, Revelation 16, verse 19, Revelation 17, verse 4, Revelation 18, verse 6. There's also a possibility that this cup is referred to in the Gospels in Mark 10:39 and Mark 14:36 and John 18:11. That's Jesus in the cup. It's a common symbol. This cup of wrath had been consistently presented to Judah from chapter 2 to chapter 25, verse 14, and now we see it now going to the other nations. So the cup represents the wrath of God. Verse 15 now gives us a turning point. We're finished with about Judah. We're now going to the cup's now going to be handed to the Gentile nations, and we're going to see the full explanation of this in chapters 46 to 51. Jeremiah's role in the judgment on the nations was first introduced back in chapter 1, verse 10. chapter 1, verse 10 says, this is God speaking to Jeremiah in his call. I have this day set you over the nations, which is the Gentiles, and over the kingdoms to pluck up and to break down and to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. So far, Jeremiah's prophetic calling has primarily focused on Judah. However, according to verse 10 of chapter 1, he was to give prophecies concerning Gentile kingdoms as well. So in this section of chapter 25, this was the beginning, and it only, as I said before, it just summarized what he would be detailing chapters 46 to 51. Now in verse 16, the effects of drinking from this cup are seen. They shall drink and reel to and fro and be mad because of the sword that I will send among them. So the content of this cup, the outpouring of divine wrath on them, which is going to be in war, would cause the nations to retch and act crazy. More specifically, it means here death, right? It means death because of the sword that he will send amongst them. So there's going to be a lot of death. In verse 17, we see Jeremiah's obedience here. He's given this task, and he says, then I took the cup at Jehovah's hand and made all the nations to drink unto whom Jehovah had sent me. So in this figure, Jeremiah took the cup from God's hand and he began going from nation to nation, causing each one to drink from it. Jeremiah gave the messages of divine judgment to each of the nations to which God had sent him. Now in verses 18 to 26 is the list of the nations to which he'll give this cup. And there's several of them are listed here. First of all, we see Judah in verse 18. To wit, Jerusalem and the cities of Judah and the kings thereof and the princes thereof, to make them a desolation, an astonishment, a hissing, and a curse, as it is this day. So the first nation listed is the one that has been primarily concerned with Judah. Judah, the southern kingdom of Israel. He gives the cup to Judah and the cities of Judah, its kings and its princes. He calls them to become what they have become, which is an astonishment, a desolation, a hissing, and a curse. Terms that had already been announced back in verses 9 and 11. So he's now called them to become exactly what they were told they were going to become. Verse 18 summarizes the prophecies of Jeremiah from chapters 2 to 45. Second, we have Egypt. The cup is given to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, his servants, his princes, his people, and all the mingled people, or the mixed multitude. The mingled people are found in Exodus chapter 12, verse 38, and it translates as mixed multitude. We'll see a lot more of this in Jeremiah 46, 1 to 28, but I'll just explain a little bit more, a couple of slides. Third, all the kings of the land of Uz. Now, Job was from the land of Uz. Job 1:1. Not much else is known about this place. It's also mentioned in Lamentations 4, verse 21. Fourth one was the land of the Philistines. It says all the kings of the Philistines and Ashkelon and Gaza and Ekron and the remnant of Ashdod. So he mentions 4 cities, Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, and the remnant of Ashdod. Now, the remnant of Ashdod, by the time this prophecy was given, Ashdod had undergone a siege by Pharaoh, and the siege lasted 39 years. And Jeremiah will deal further with the Philistines in chapter 47, verses 1 to 6. Then we had in verse 21, Edom and Moab and the children of Ammon. So he now turns to the Transjordanian nations, which is on the east bank of the Jordan River, and 3 nations here. We have Edom, dealt with in Jeremiah 49, 7 to 22, Moab, Jeremiah 48, 1 to 47, and Ammon in Jeremiah 49, 1 to 6. And now the 8th one we have in verse 22 are the Phoenicians, all the kings of Tyre and all the kings of Sidon and the kings of the isle, which is beyond the sea. Now, Tyre and Sidon were the main cities of Phoenicia, And the rest of the verse then refers to the other Phoenician cities and colonies, such as Tarsus. Tarsus is one of the Phoenician cities. And then verse 23 and 24, we have the ninth, that's Arabia. It says, Dedan and Timar and Buz and all that have the corners of their hair cut off, or the kings of Arabia and all the kings of the mingled people that dwell in the wilderness. So again, here we have the phrase mingled people, mixed multitude. What it is, it's a combination. What it actually is, it's a combination of different races that come together in a nation, and then they attach themselves to one people, and then they dwell as strangers among that people. So in the Exodus, there was a mixed multitude attached themselves to the Jewish people as they left, and this is exactly what they did back in Exodus 12 verse 38. Nehemiah 13:3 speaks about the mixed multitude as well. In Nehemiah 13 verse 3 says, "It came to pass when they had heard the law that they separated from Israel all the mixed multitude," or the mingled people. Now, the prophecy concerning Arabia, we're going to see more detail in 49, 28 to 33. In the 10th Gentile nation, verse 25 is the Far East. It says all the kings of Zimri and all the kings of Elam and all the kings of the Medes. Well, we don't know at the moment of any known city or country by the name of Zimri. Details of the prophecy against Elam are provided in Jeremiah 49, 34 to 39. And in the 11th, in verse 26, he summarizes the entire world. "And all the kings of the north, far and near, one with another, and all the kingdoms of the world which are upon the face of the earth." So this is so all of these nations in verse 26 with the other kings as well. Then it states here that the last to drink after all the kings of the earth is one last king, and the king of Shishak shall drink after them. Now, Shishak corresponds with the Hebrew way of saying Babylon. He simply used this play upon words. It's a method that they use at Bash, and he changed Babylon into Shishak. And he'll use this term again in Jeremiah 51, verse 41. It speaks of Shishak and Babylon in the same sentence. Now, notice here that in the list of the nations and kingdoms, the word king is always in the plural, it's always kings. The exception is the king of Shishak. The details regarding this king are found in Jeremiah 50 and 51. And when we look at those chapters, we're going to see Jeremiah was not dealing with the fall of Babylon in 538, 537, 536 BC. That was not what he was dealing with. But he was dealing with the final overthrow of Babylon in the tribulation. And that is in Isaiah chapter 13, verse 1 to chapter 14, verse 23. And you can have a look also in Revelation chapter 18, verses 1 to 24. So at that time, in the distant future, judgment will come against one particular king of Babylon, and that will be the Antichrist. Now, according to the book of Revelation, this king will be the last one to drink of the cup of God's wrath, which is what Jeremiah 25:26 is predicting here. For this prophecy to be fulfilled, the city of Babylon will have to be rebuilt into a major city where the king will sit, the Antichrist. The command to drink we find in verses 27 to 29. So we have the list of nations, complete with Babylon being the last. Verse 27, "You shall say unto them, Thus says Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, Drink ye and be drunken, and spew and fall and rise no more, because of the sword which I will send among you." So here he is pictured as taking the cup and ordering the nations to drink. And when they drink, they'll spew, they'll fall, and they'll rise no more. So this verse here shows us that the cup represents God's judgment. The means of judgment will be by the sword, which is by military conquest. Verse 28, according to verse 28, none of the nations will have the option of refusal. And it shall be, if they refuse to take the cup at your hand to drink, then shall you say unto them, thus says Jehovah of hosts, you shall surely drink. Now these nations denied the prophecies of Jeremiah 46 to 51. Therefore, Jehovah declares that there is no way to avoid his decree. When God says, take this cup, it's not an invitation, it is a command. So what the nations refuse to accept will surely happen to them. And these prophecies will be fulfilled and God's wrath will take place. Now, verse 29 provides a background of the certainty. For lo, I begin to work evil at the city which is called by my name, and should you be utterly unpunished, you shall not be unpunished. For I will call for a sword upon all the inhabitants of the earth, says Jehovah of hosts. So what he's saying here is that the nations are assured that wrath will be poured out against them. Why? Because God had punished his own people. The judgment in Jerusalem was just the beginning of an extensive judgment that would cover all nations. If he had punished those who were called by his own name, he would certainly call for a sword upon all the Gentile nations and punish them. We now have the interpretation in verses 30 to 38. This is interpretation of the symbolic action, which began back in verse 13. Verse 13 says, I'll bring upon that land all my words which I've pronounced against it, even all that is written in this book, which Jeremiah has prophesied against all the nations. So in verses 30 to 31 is the voice of God. First of all, God is pictured as a roaring, well, he's pictured as roaring in the first part of verse 30. Therefore, prophesy you against them all these words, and say unto them, Jehovah will roar from on high and utter his voice from his holy habitation. He will mightily roar against his fold. So as a lion suddenly bursts roaring from his lair, so Jehovah is seen as a lion coming out with a roar, and here he roars against his own flock, his fold. What he roars against will fall. God, pictured in the figure of lion, is also found in Hosea 11:10, Joel 2:16, Amos chapter 1, verse 2, and chapter 3, verse 8. Second, not only will he roar like a lion, but he'll also shout in the second part of verse 30. He'll give a shout as they that tread the grapes against all the inhabitants of the earth. He'll shout the shout of those who tread grapes. They shouted and sang in the joy of harvest. It was a great time, noisy time, harvest time, when they're treading the grapes. But these Gentile nations are viewed as grapes in a vat, in a wine vat. And God will shout the shout of judgment as he treads them down. And these are the grapes of wrath. And this is also the picture of the nations being trodden down on the judgment in a wine vat in Revelation chapter 14, verses 17 to 20. Chapter 14, Revelation 17 to 20. The third picture we see here is also that of a noise in verse 31. We go from a roar to a shout, now to a noise. A noise shall come even to the end of the earth, for Jehovah has a controversy with the nations. He'll enter into judgment with all flesh. As for the wicked, he'll give them to the sword, says Jehovah. So the noise which God will make covers the entire earth. It is a noise as God presents his controversy or his legal brief against the nations. That's what controversy is. It's like a legal brief. So in this trial, there would be a judge, but no jury. There'd be an indictment, but no defense, and there'd be a sentence, but no appeal. Judgment is set. The noise is the noise as he gives the wicked the power of the sword. 32 to 38 is a description of the judgment that shall go out against the nations. In 32 to 33, he deals with the calamity upon the nations. Thus says Jehovah of hosts, behold, Evil shall go forth from nation to nation, and a great tempest shall be raised up from the uttermost parts of the earth. So this calamity goes from one nation to another. Eventually, all the nations will fall to this divine calamity sent upon them. The tempest is raised from the uttermost parts of the earth. And when the judgment finally comes, it will be on a worldwide scale. Again, ultimately, these types of descriptions will only find their fulfillment in God's judgments in the Great Tribulation. And Jeremiah will deal with this more extensively in chapters 30 to 33. Now, verse 33. And the slain of Jehovah shall be at that day from one end of the earth, even unto the other end of the earth. They shall not be lamented, neither gathered nor buried. They shall be dung upon the face of the ground. So when God's judgments against the nations are completed on this worldwide scale, the slain, who are the dead, are pictured as lying scattered from one end of the earth to the other. Bodies will lie everywhere, unlamented, ungathered, unburied. Now, earlier, God said that this would be true of the Jews in the judgment of Judah back in chapter 8, verse 2, chapter 8, verse 2, chapter 9, verse 21, chapter 9, verse 21, and chapter 16, verse 4. So back then, this was with all the dead bodies, the bodies would lie as dung on the earth for the inhabitants of Judah. But in the future, it's also going to be true of the Gentiles. Here we have the calamity of the shepherds in 34 to 37. This calamity will strike the leadership of these nations. Wail, ye shepherds, and cry and wallow in ashes, ye principal of the flock. For the days of your slaughter and of your dispersions are fully come, and you shall fall like a goodly vessel. So in verse 34, they're going to lament. He says, you principal of the flock. Now, this expression refers to the upper class of these nations. They'll break out wailing. None of them will escape the calamity, and the days of their slaughter and dispersion will have come. And as a result, they're going to fall and shatter like precious jars, like a goodly vessel. So neither the shepherd nor the upper classes will be able to escape. And verse 35 reaffirms that the judgment will be inescapable. The shepherds shall have no way to flee, nor the principal of the flock to escape. There'll be no way for the shepherds and the upper classes to flee. Their wealth will not help them at all. And in 36 to 37, we have the reasons why the shepherds wail and lament in verse 34. Verse 36 says, a voice of the cry of the shepherds and the wailing of the principal of the flock, for Jehovah lays waste their pasture. In verse 37, and the peaceable foals are brought to silence because of the fierce anger of Jehovah. Shepherds and masters of the different Gentile nations will be wailing because their countries will be utterly destroyed. As Jehovah desolated Judah, so he will desolate them. The devastation that results from Jehovah's fierce anger will cause widespread silence. Their whole land is now desolate. Their peaceable fields are now brought to silence because of desolation. Nothing, empty. The chapter now ends with the picture of God as a lion in verse 38. He has left his covert as the lion, for their land has become an astonishment because of the fierceness of the oppressing sword and because of his fierce anger. So the picture here is that of a lion moving out of his lair. God is seen as having left the thicket to move to judgment. When he finishes his roaring and tearing, the whole earth will become a horror because of the immensity of the devastation and his fierce anger. And that can only be seen in the tribulation judgments. So this section in chapter 25, verses 15 to 38 functions now as an introduction or prelude to chapters 46 to 51. In our next session in chapter 26, he returns to the issue of Judah, and Jeremiah then continues to focus upon Judah all the way to chapter 45. And then in Jeremiah I'm just telling you what's happening. Jeremiah 46 to 51, he will one by one then elaborate upon God's judgment that will come upon the nations, which we just covered today. And the complete fulfillment of a number of these things will only come much later in the Great Tribulation, while other prophecies of Jeremiah had a much nearer fulfillment. So that, friends, is the end for this session. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong. And we'll see you again next week, next session. God bless.